trying to do in Parliament. Thanks a lot to the Labour Irish Society, the Labour Movement for Europe, and Labour for a European Future for hosting the event and indeed inviting me to chair it. My name's Adam Payne. I'm a political reporter at Business Insider, where I mainly report on Brexit and have done for the last few years for my sins. I'll be chairing this event from my living room in North London, and I'm going to be putting my questions to this excellent panel we have, but also we'll have lots of time for questions of your own. So if you do have questions, just drop them in the Zoom chat box, and hopefully I'll be able to ask them all. As for our panel, I'll give you little introductions in no particular order. We've got Catherine West, who isn't with us right now, but I'm reassured will be joining us imminently. Catherine's a Shadow Foreign Minister, the MP for Hornsey and Wood Green. First elected to Parliament in 2015, Catherine, of course, was a passionate advocate of the UK's place in Europe and has done lots of work on trade and the rights of EU citizens. We have Theresa Griffin. Theresa, until recently, was the Labour MEP for the northwest of England. As an MEP, she did tons of work on lots of issues, really, the energy, universities, among other things. And I know from my experience of working with her that she's very much on top of the policy detail. Speaking of being on top of policy, we have Matthew O'Toole. Matt was a civil servant in the Treasury on Downing Street around the time of the referendum. He's now an MLA in the Northern Irish Assembly and the Brexit spokesperson for the SDLP. We have Allison Roche. Allison, a policy officer at UNISON, the country's largest trade union. She's been there for 12 years. Her specialist subjects are Brexit and trade, and of course she's been pushing for the best possible Brexit outcome for workers and their rights. And last but not least, we have Mike Buckley. Mike is a campaigner, a writer, and an influential voice on all things Brexit within the Labour movement. And he is the director of Labour for European Future. So to kick us off, each panelist is going to have around 3 minutes just to grapple with the title question of what are the unanswered questions when it comes to Brexit. So I'll start with Theresa, if that's okay.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. As the European Parliamentary Labour Party, we were heavily involved with negotiations across the Socialists and Democrats group and the Party of European Socialists to progress legislation that will improve the lives of all Europeans. Adam, how do we maintain that influence? With the Brexit deadline, every day since the referendum, a member of another delegation will have said to me, please stay, we want you to remain. Withdrawal is a political tragedy that will damage the economic well-being and social fabric of the UK and diminish our country's standing in the world. Even by the more conservative estimates, the hit to the GDP of no deal to the Northwest is 12%. 70% of our medicines come from the 27. But the loss goes beyond the cold, hard economic damage. It's about saying goodbye to the most successful peace project in history, a project that the UK was instrumental in setting up. How do we now influence the progressive future we need? For the clean air we want for our children, to eradicating energy poverty, to workers' rights. With colleagues from the SDLP, we were instrumental in the declaration of an EU-wide climate emergency, just transitioned to a decarbonised economy, and secured a commitment to a truly ambitious 55% CO2 reductions by 2030, confirmed in the State of the EU address this week. How do we hold the Tories to account now on climate change? The UK has had such influence in the EU. After the Grenfell fire, I spoke to a socialist MEP who was the rapporteur on the Energy Efficiency in Buildings Directive, and I asked her to include requiring increased fire safety and suppression standards in all new European buildings. We did it. Will the UK live up to the same standards after Brexit? And this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Until the 31st of January, every day for 45 years, a Labour representative has spoken up for our values in Europe. The Labour Party has sent a delegation to the European Parliament since '75, and every day we've used our influence to secure the progressive, internationalist, environmentalist, humanitarian, democratic, social Europe that we all need. Who will speak up for us now?
Thank you, Theresa. Alison, would you like to give us your thoughts, please?
Yes. My first instinct when I saw the question was, there are too many unanswered questions. How am I going to fit all that into 3 minutes? So I just thought I'd choose 3 things. The first one was, as we know, the withdrawal agreement that Boris gave us removed the level playing field. And we were then told we're going to get this new employment bill, which will have a means to uphold our existing employment rights, for example, in social provisions, and there would be some sort of agency that would enforce that. And I've got loads of questions around this replacement. Firstly, would the Secretary of State have new powers to stop non-regression from what we've got? Would this new Secretary of State have powers to impose dynamic alignment against what we have with Europe? Would we have a social partnership structure? Because we've never had that in the UK since we've always relied with that on the EU. And essentially, how is that going to be shaped? I've not seen a draft of this paper. I'm not sure if there's even consultations on this paper. So that's my first kind of query. What and how are the means are we going to have protections around these employment rights that were removed from the withdrawal agreement? The second thing, just to mention, obviously I'm on the Labour Party Irish Society Executive. And one of the things we've been very concerned about for Irish citizens is we've asked the government repeatedly, can you explain to us what rights we have in the Common Travel Area Agreement versus if we applied for EU settled status? We've asked them in a few of the Brexit bills that have gone through Parliament, and I think recently we've just asked in the Lords as well, and we've still had no response apart from don't worry, everything's okay. Which doesn't actually assure us very much, especially given we know with the Internal Market Bill, for example, that the government is prepared to rip up international agreements. And also frontier workers, those who live in the Republic and work across the border in Northern Ireland, we've been asking what's going to be this permit that you're going to offer, what's the details? So these are outstanding questions that do concern us. The third thing I'll just mention is, when are we going to get transparency? These are really serious issues in these trade deals, and it's not just with Brexit. We've got consecutive or simultaneous agreements going on, free trade agreements trying to be made with America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Some of the trade unions have been invited to sit on these expert trade advisory groups. We got removed without any explanation about 3 weeks ago. But even when we were participating, we had no future agenda. They were very ad hoc. They were just presentations where you couldn't actually compare what you're going to get with Japan versus the EU. So for experts, like some of us are in the trade union movement on trade deals, it was very disappointing, and we're glad to say the TUC have raised that. The real issues that I'm concerned about, for example, in a public service union, is public procurement, where the government's made it clear it's not going to align with the EU, but with the US, which is not a better deal for us as for our public services. And the second issue would be around digital rights and AI rights, where we know that the EU is beginning to look at how we can regulate that better. The US is doing the opposite, trying to prevent that regulation. So I'll just leave those thoughts there. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Alison. Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you very much to the Labour Party Irish Society for organising this event and for having me to speak. Unanswered questions on Brexit, unfortunately, could fill a library. There are many more questions that have there are many more questions than there are answers. I think tragically, one of the answers we do have is that the zealot fundamentalist Brexit right of the Conservative Party has won the argument within that party, and they have a clear majority in the House of Commons. So that throws up very, very difficult questions, I think, for all of us who are on the left and want to see maintenance of the protections that come from membership of the European Union, but also for those of us in Northern Ireland and the Labour Party Irish Society have been extremely strong allies, consistent allies in terms of getting answers for the people of Northern Ireland, the people of the whole island of Ireland around protections in relation to the peace process. 3, as I said, there are an infinite number of unanswered questions around Brexit. Alison's touched on several of them, as has Theresa, but to pick 3 big structural ones. 1, is the UK going to be serious about delivery of the protocol? Is Boris Johnson's government going to get serious about delivery of the protocol in a way that works for people, workers and businesses in Northern Ireland? The protocol is an unlovely set of protections, but it's an essential set of protections, and it's all the more essential because of the ideological zeal and the recklessness behind the current government. So we need for them to be clear that they are delivering the protocol and the protections that go alongside it. Are they going to do that? That's number 1. Clearly, the internal market bill would indicate that they are at least thinking of being reckless about it. Question number 2 is, I think, a broader question about the kind of relationship the UK will have with the European Union going forward. For the sake of Northern Ireland, frankly, for the sake of everyone in the UK, I'd like that to be as close as possible. Allison talked about the various, the need to have a closer relationship in terms of non-level playing field. All of the things we've talked about in terms of environmental labour protections that we know come from the European Union. The closer Britain, frankly, is to a European future, I think the better we can feel about some of those issues, better than we would be if Dominic Cummings had his way with them. That's a big unanswered question, and we won't know for a while yet where we are on that. And then I think lastly, the final unanswered question is really about the attitude of the UK government to devolved institutions more broadly. There's a specific and enormous set of challenges in relation to Northern Ireland, but there's also evidence that they are deciding to undermine another huge Labour achievement, which is the devolved settlement in other parts of the UK. So that's another unanswered question. Those are 3 big structural ones, but there are unfortunately an infinite number of others.
Thanks, Matthew. There are an infinite number. We'll try and cover as many as we can in the next hour or so. Mike, what are your thoughts, please?
Great, thanks, Adam, and thanks all. Lots of issues raised already, and you're right. We could do this for days, but we haven't got days. We've got about an hour. So I thought I would cover the unanswered question of how Labour's going to handle Brexit over the next 4 years, and I'm sure Catherine will have words to add, or maybe to clarify or correct when we get to Catherine. But the 2 points I want to make are, I mean, context, obviously, I get that Labour has not wanted to major on Brexit this year because we've got a new leadership. The public were clearly tired of talking about Brexit after all the shenanigans in Parliament over the last few years. And also, we can't stop Brexit. It's going to happen. So there's no point here using PMQs every week to talk about Brexit, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. However, to think over the next 4 years, there are 2 things that Labour has to get right. First, it can't say nothing about Brexit and our future relationship with Europe. We've got to have an opinion and justify why we've got that opinion. And secondly, if we're going to win next time, we need to have an accurate understanding of our electorate and our possible next electoral coalition. And it's that understanding that is not a simple process, but it is possible. So to take these issues in turn, firstly, what we're going to say about Brexit. I mean, I think the first thing I'm sure all of us on this call recognise is that Brexit has got no better just because the Conservatives won an election. It still costs 5% of our GDP. As Theresa said, that's worse in lots of different parts of the country, like 12% in the northwest. It harms our security and defence cooperation. It ends our commitment to standards in food, environmental protections, workers' rights, safety standards, all of which we know the government wants to take down. So we know that all of this together makes building the equal, prosperous, fair and safe country that Labour wants to build much more difficult. We have to have an opinion on that and recognise that that's the reality that we're in. And indeed, lots of the voters that we want to get back their lives are going to be made worse by Brexit, and we need to be honest with them. So, and also we'll get repeated questions on this over the next 4 years. We've got to have an answer. So that brings me to point 2, which is how we're going to build our next electoral coalition. So of course the media narrative, and to some degree the Labour narrative, is that we've got to win back the lost seats in the Red Wall, which is North Wales, the Midlands and the north of England. And that's true, but it's also nowhere near enough. We've also got to win back seats in Scotland. In 2010, we had 41. We've now got 1. Remember, we lost in 2010. So we need to get a whole chunk of those seats back and win lots of seats in England. We also need to recognise that some of the Red Wall seats we lost might never come back. They didn't go in 2019 just because of Brexit or even just because of Jeremy Corbyn. They went in 2019 because of a long-term process of how our electorate has been changing, essentially shifting in large part from the working class to the middle class and from towns to cities. To some degree, we do need to reverse that. There aren't enough cities, but we may not be able to reverse it entirely, which means that we also need to pick up seats in parts of the south that we haven't held for a long time, or maybe have never held, and win back seats in Scotland if we're going to have a chance of forming a majority government. Scotland's really important. They're obviously very pro-European. They voted en masse for Remain in 2016. And that is an open door for us to go and win seats if we can make the case for more, greater pro-European engagement. And finally, just to come back to the Red Wall, it's also a mistake to think that all the Red Wall voters are Leave voters. Like the rest of the country, they're very split. And even in 2015 and 2017, most Labour voters were Remainers. There were some Labour Leave voters, and some of those voters have gone and voted for the Conservatives in 2019, but actually the majority of our voters were Remainers. And if we are not pro-European, which doesn't necessarily mean rejoin, but it means being pro-European to a degree, we risk losing a lot of those Remain voters to the Lib Dems or in Scotland to the SNP, and we may not get back the Leave voters. We could lose on all sides. So all of this it's a complicated environment for Labour to be in. But I think what this comes down to is 2 things. It comes down to A, having an opinion that you can justify, and B, understanding our electorate and understanding that we can't just say, yes, Brexit's fine and move on, because it clearly isn't in tangible economic security, jobs, livelihoods terms, but also that wouldn't be the right thing for us to do electorally.
Cheers, Mike. And finally, we have Catherine West. Catherine, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Now you can hear me, can't you? Yes.
We can indeed.
Great. First of all, thank you for all the coverage that you've given to Brexit, and thank you for visiting Northern Ireland and being across all the detail, because for some political journalists, I think Brexit has appeared a bit too hard or whatever, and yourself, Lisa O'Carroll and some of the others have been fantastic at really sticking with the detail on it. I wanted to make 2 points. The first is Labour wants a close relationship with Europe. And whereas Mrs May even was saying that 6 months ago, the difference now is that really the Tory party is a very different beast now from what it was even 6 months ago. Once UKIP didn't stand candidates in the 2019 general election and its vote collapsed into the Tory party, and several of their high profile Remain champions didn't stand, we really do have a very different feel to this parliament. And I think that's the context that we have to face politically. Our strategy so far has been under Rachel Reeves to ask about the oven-ready deal and how soon Mr Johnson would get Brexit done, which was his promise to the electorate, that it was all ready, it was in the oven, all we had to do was cook it. And yet we've seen that, as per ever, it's been a promise that hasn't been kept, and we've ended up with a shambolic negotiation, particularly in the last 2 weeks, where the Tory party has failed to live up to its own internationalist values. Even Michael Hague, Michael Howard and others have been criticising their own party for wanting to renege on a deal. So there's that bigger question around the geopolitics and what is happening outside the UK, and Amal Clooney today standing up and saying what she said in relation to not wanting to be an envoy on behalf of all that we stand for is really quite upsetting for those of us who have a cross-party vision of what it is to be an international player. The other, of course, aspect is the actual detail of the Brexit and the fact that I think for many businesses, they're losing confidence now in the government. And this is where Labour has been good in terms of pointing out the detail, and we will continue to do that. When I sat on the Trade Select Committee last year, we looked very closely at what was happening in terms of what would need to be put in on any putative border between the Republic and Northern Ireland. And we know that there aren't enough vets. We know that there still isn't an agreement on phytosanitary or sanitary measures. We know that this is what actually led to the government having to rethink some of this, and I think every day that goes by, business is losing confidence in the Tory party. So I will be very interested in seeing what will happen eventually, because Mike quite rightly says that Labour needs to, play to many different audiences, and I'll be very interested to see whether business confidence continues to drop under this government. We also know that in terms of our bigger footprint, in terms of the geopolitics of where the US is committed to Ireland being very much a part of any future US-UK trade deal, which gives us a fantastic lever. And also, in terms of what we're trying to do either with China or Russia, we obviously need to be in lockstep with European partners. And that's also a very strong message that we can use as well. So I'll stop there, Adam, because I know that there'll be questions, but they're the three things: the geopolitics of it, the new Tory party as we know it, the new definition of the Tory party, and thirdly, the actual detail, which we will continue to hammer them on in the Commons.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks a lot for your very kind remark at the beginning. Right, so there are so many things we can talk about, and we're not spoilt for time. So I'm going to start with what feels like the natural place to start, Northern Ireland. It's been brought up numerous times already. We know what the government is trying to do with the Internal Market Bill, unilaterally determining elements of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Matthew, for you represent people and businesses in Northern Ireland who, even before this move from the government, they had so much uncertainty regarding January 2021, what they're going to be preparing for. What have people and businesses been saying to you about what the government is doing at the moment in regards to Northern Ireland and the protocol?
Well, I think there is a widespread despair would be one way of putting it, but I think in a sense it's not just despair, it's kind of amazement that that the government, any government, could be so reckless. To take a step back about what the Ireland Protocol is and why it's necessary. The Ireland Protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, as it's officially known, is a set of protections for Northern Ireland that were previously, in their first instance, the backstop and insurance policy, but Boris Johnson demanded that they be made, in a sense, a permanent front stop. They mean that Northern Ireland remains in the single market for goods and the EU customs union, in order that you do not have a hard border in goods on the island of Ireland. There will be, it's worth saying, a hardened border in lots of other areas, including on services provision, services regulation, loads and loads of other things. The need for the protocol hasn't gone away. What has changed is that Boris Johnson has decided, for what seemed like extraordinarily irresponsible, reckless, is putting it very mildly, I would say almost borderline immoral political reasons, has decided to make delivery of the protocol a negotiating tool at this kind of heated stage in the overall trade talks. Businesses in Northern Ireland, as with businesses and workers everywhere across the UK, across the world, are dealing with, trying to grapple with, trying to understand the consequences of this once in a century pandemic which has happened. We don't know how we're going to be working by Christmas. We don't know where we're going to be this time next year in terms of what happens to our economy, in terms of how we're living and working. The idea that the government is even considering ending the transition period without a deal at the end of this year is frankly unconscionable. So to begin this conversation, we kind of have to start by acknowledging that the right of the Tory party have moved the Overton window, as it were, have moved the realm of what's politically possible to such an extraordinary and extreme place that it's now become possible that we could leave the transition period without a deal. I think businesses in Northern Ireland in particular, because in addition to everything else, they're going to have to get used to the special arrangements around the protocol, are just amazed that they're even being put in this position. So they've got minimal information about how the protocol is being delivered. And by the way, most of them want the protocol to be delivered. Businesses want the clarity and certainty that there isn't going to be a hard land border, but they want to see clear delivery and mitigation from the UK. They want to see the EU help them with that too, but they particularly want to see the UK come up with the practical steps that they need. And yes, the financial mitigations in terms of delivering it. They're not getting any of that. They weren't getting it before the Internal Markets Bill. They were getting obfuscation, bits and pieces of information here and there. There was a command paper in May that Michael Gove launched, and it was full of sort of sovereigntist, tub-thumping language. And it's only gotten worse since then with the Internal Markets Bill. So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. I think to boil it down, frankly, there's just anxiety, worry, and a degree of amazement, as I say, that any government could be this irresponsible with people's not just livelihoods, but with, as Theresa said earlier on, a peace project. It's very, very, very troubling. That's not to say that anyone loves the protocol in and of itself. It is an imperfect tool. It's an imperfect set of protections from what Boris Johnson and his acolytes want, which is the hardest possible Brexit, the sharpest possible split from the European single market and the structures of the EU. That means that there has to be a threshold of regulation. There has to be a customs checks, as it were, somewhere. And for a variety of reasons, it is much more practical for them to be between the islands of Britain and Ireland. But no one would have chosen this outcome at the beginning of the Brexit process. It's less worse than the awful vista that Boris and his acolytes seem to have in store for us.
Cheers, Matthew. I'm just going to pick up on something you mentioned in your response. Then, a lot of things we talk about when it comes for anyone who is unfortunate enough to follow Brexit on a regular basis will know that a big concern is that we just don't have time for these things. Whether it's IT systems they're building to manage cross-border trade, whether it's SMEs getting ready for new trading arrangements, whether it is businesses in Northern Ireland who might just have weeks to prepare for new trade with GB. The consensus says time is running out. We're not going to have enough time, and whatever happens is going to be chaos on January the 1st. With that in mind, and this is a question to everyone on the panel, did Labour make a misjudgment in not at least being open to the idea of extending the transition period? I don't know who wants to handle that first. Maybe Theresa?
Thank you. It's absolutely clear that we need an extension to the transition period, and I think the European Parliamentary Labour Party, as we still exist, were quite clear about that. But I'd like to come back to some of what Matthew was saying, and thank you so much for organising this. I've got family in Derry and I've got family in Donegal, and I have to say that there is just complete bewilderment about how we've actually managed to end up where we are. And as part of the GFA, there were 13 cross-border health services, so that you got taken to the nearest A&E for you. You didn't have to go, for instance, from Donegal to Galway if there was a facility in Derry. I've been asking since the day after the referendum what's happening in terms of those 13 cross-border health services, and I haven't had an answer. Matthew may know more.
The work is going on it, Theresa, but they haven't, for a variety of reasons, they haven't been able to completely bottom out how the rest of us are going to work. I think, this is one of the many unanswered questions. To give you another one, and to answer your specific question, Adam, to take my turn, yes, absolutely. I think there should be an extension to the transition period. I understand why Keir and some of the leadership have made that decision not to call for that. We called for it very loudly. We passed a motion for it in the Northern Ireland Assembly. And just to show you how disingenuous the language from Gove and Johnson has been, throughout, for the previous couple of years, they've talked about how important the voice of the Northern Ireland Assembly was when it was in abeyance. I remember saying when I was in my old job as a civil service spokesperson, it would be great if the Northern Ireland Assembly could be there and making its its voice heard. We came back, we made our voice heard. They haven't even acknowledged it. Nothing but complete contempt for the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. It's really, really scandalous. So yes, absolutely, there should be an extension. And as I said in my previous answer, the fact that there wasn't just an automatic move towards extending the transition period is really a sign of how unbelievably strange and surreal the debate has become at Westminster, and how this, frankly, slightly crazy right wing of Brexitism has taken over the Conservative Party and infected the debate there. It really shouldn't have been a debate once the biggest pandemic in a century started, that you extend a transition period by a few months. That shouldn't be an ideological thing. That should be just basic common sense.
Catherine, can I just come to you a second? Just obviously we've got the this coming week, I think we've got parliamentary votes on the internal market bill. If the government does plough ahead with, obviously Boris Johnson has reached a compromise with Tory MPs, but ultimately the bill still seeks to break international law. What will the Labour Party do in response to the government if indeed it ploughs ahead with this policy? And secondly, you've heard from Theresa and from Matthew about the transition period. Can you understand, although Labour Party policy is to push for a deal, and you ruled out extending the transition period, do you understand where they're coming from?
So on the bill at second reading, we had a reasoned amendment, which obviously they voted down. But if you put a reasoned amendment in, which is, in my view, very reasonable, saying that on no account should we break international law, of course, the government and Tory backbenchers did not support our amendment. And to be fair, it's quite unusual for a government and non-government Tory MPs to support a Labour motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. However, given that is the case, we are relying on the likes of Bob Neill and others for their amendment. Now, I understand that Bob was in a meeting and that he's had assurances that if push comes to shove, there will be a parliamentary debate and a parliamentary vote if it ever came close to actually breaking international law. Now, he seemed to have been satisfied with that. However, there are some within his camp who are not pleased that feel that doesn't go far enough. So I don't think we've seen quite the bottom of this rebellion yet. Bob Neill, as you know, used to be a minister, local government minister during the coalition. And he's been really strong on this point because obviously he's the chair of the Justice Select Committee, which I think means he has to obey the law and call for the law to be obeyed. However, the big politics of this is, as you all know, that Brexit is the one issue that keeps the Tory party together, the new Tory party, because obviously the Tory party now is not the Tory party it was in Parliament this time a year ago. So I think part of the reason why the government wanted to have Brexit on the agenda and was hoping that Labour would fall into the trap of wanting to talk about it again as much as the Tories do, was so that they could just stand up in the Commons opposite us and say, Labour doesn't really want Brexit. Labour didn't listen to the election result. Look how many of us we are. We have an 80 majority and so on. Instead, I think we've had to actually try and hold them to their word about the detail of the protocol. And now that they can see that the protocol is actually quite unworkable, hurts business, and is really bad for the peace deal, you know, in terms of the way that Michael Gover's interpreting it, they actually have a huge problem on their hands. The other thing is that they would technically have had to take their MPs through the lobbies to have voted for a delay to Brexit. And we felt that that was not something which, following the 2019 election, was going to be very likely. However, I do think we have an opportunity now to look reasonable and to encourage compromise and to encourage a deal, because we're now in the territory of the government saying that, well, maybe, or parts of the government saying, well, maybe a no deal is best. And as you know, we've always been against a no deal Brexit. As it looks, we're probably going to have to look at a hard Brexit, which is against, you know, many of our views and many of what we believe in. But I think there's a huge difference between a no deal Brexit and a hard Brexit. Still, there is a big difference. So, you know, our job now is to look at what they come back with, and to carefully monitor what they do, to give them a hard time with the internal market bill this week, and when it comes back from the Lords in October, and to work across with our sister parties in Europe, putting pressure on Dominic Raab, putting pressure on Boris Johnson, and as Ed Miliband so eloquently said, getting them to take responsibility for the rhetoric which they've carried on with since 2016. Now that the rhetoric has to actually be translated into reality, they will see, and they are seeing, just how very difficult it is to make this work in people's everyday lives.
Thanks, Catherine. Alison, I'm just going to come to you one moment. I'm trying to cover as much ground as we possibly can. For someone like yourself who represents hundreds of thousands of workers nationwide and their rights, what are the issues that are really concerning you at the moment in regards to the future relationship negotiation, what this UK government is seeking for standards, workers, etc.? I know the list is probably endless, but what are the key concerns for you at the moment? Alison?
Yeah, sorry.
Right, I thought we'd lost you then. But...
Well, going back to the internal market bill, actually, it is a hard Brexit anyway. It's actually wiring in a hard Brexit, because what it actually does, it actually is introducing tighter regulations that you actually get in trade than you do in WTO rules. So don't forget, if it's a hard Brexit or no deal, we're just going to default to WTO, okay? Now, in WTO rules, there's something called TRIPS, which says that you can discriminate in an internal market. It doesn't have to just be an emergency, you actually can discriminate if it's linked to public health issues. What this government is actually putting in its internal market bill is saying you can't discriminate at all unless we decide it's an emergency. So that is actually introducing a hard wiring into our own internal market, harder rules than you've actually got in the WTO. So why is the government doing that? If you look at what it's doing alongside the internal market bill, it's actually introducing, or at the moment the consultation, I'm not sure how the government's responding, the proposal was to allow lower courts to depart from EU retained law under ECJ case rule. What that means, for example, would be all lower courts, and how this relates to Northern Ireland we're still not even clear about. But it means that if you wanted to challenge a ruling in the UK that had used ECJ law, human rights law, then go ahead. The government is saying, we're opening up the gate, you can come and now challenge this. What we now understand is the internal market bill and the departure from EU retained law is all about basically moving us away from any legalisation or regulation, basically. Not only is it saying that we're not going to be aligned, it's actually saying we can actually rip up and unpick all the bits we had anywhere and everywhere. Okay, so that is what we're really concerned about. We're thinking it's going to snowball complete and utter chaos in the legal system. And if human rights is ripped up on top of that, a lot of workers' laws like two-pay rights, which is the protections of when you are being outsourced or privatised under public procurement contracting, for example, that can be now challenged, because some of that law was upheld by ECJ case law. It wasn't UK law. So that is our major concern. Why is the government is deliberately unpicking and allowing the unpicking of all ECJ case law, which actually threatens, it's not just employment rights, it's lots of other little bits that they're chipping away to allow basically the lowering of everything. And it will just be a race to the bottom, because we already know they're not going to listen to what Joe Biden's saying or Nancy Pelosi about a democratic bill. They are under the belief that if Trump gets in, they are going to chip away and get the deal that they want with the United States, and that's why they're not aligning. That's our major concern. So what that means is that we have to really campaign around preventing lower courts from trying to, from rulings that would unpick all our case law that protects our rights. And it's not just employment rights, it can be environmental rights, social rights, digital rights, consumer rights. Even business can go at it and rip up red tape. It's going to be huge. The government is expecting apparently an avalanche. That's why they've introduced it. That's why they're saying the Supreme Court will not be able to cope. We don't know why they're expecting this, but we think it's all to do with trade deals, so that, because the ECJ won't be regulating us anymore, big business can use the UK courts to rip up competition law, anything you like. It really is, you know, quite frightening what's happening. And what's really frightening is some of this detail is so technical and legal, even I don't understand it. I have to rely on legal experts to explain parts of it, constitutional experts, and I've been doing Brexit for 4 years. So it really is worrying, and trying to get that message across some of these concerns is something that I think we've all got to try and work hard in the next couple of months, especially if there's going to be a no deal.
Thank you, Alison. I mean, you've raised several issues there, and there are so many more. I'm just going to return to a point that Mike raised in his introductory remarks. And Mike, I'm going to come to you first to answer the question. As far as I can tell, Labour policy at the moment is urging the government to get a Brexit deal, to get it done and focus on the coronavirus. Is there a risk, do you think, of by just telling the Prime Minister to get a deal and not really wanting to talk about Brexit if possible, that issues like the ones Alison's just discussed, Northern Ireland, citizens and workers' rights, etc., perhaps don't get the attention they deserve? So what I'm saying is, should Labour be talking about Brexit more, despite the electoral consequences we've touched upon already?
I mean, I think there are clearly two answers to that question, one of them being yes and the other one being no. And I fully understand why Labour doesn't want to major on Brexit and wants to instead have, you know, just a clear run at saying this government is incompetent, they've let tens of thousands of people die unnecessarily from coronavirus, we're under new management, you know, we would do a better job than them. You know, it's important for Labour to get that message out loud and clear. And it's important for us not to be seen to be kind of continuing the Leave Remain divide, which didn't do anybody any good, because for years people had just stopped listening to each other. We were all just talking over each other. So I do understand that entirely. And I agree wholeheartedly with Catherine that getting a deal is far better than not getting a deal. And it helps Labour and it helps the country for Labour to be saying, you said you'd get a deal, you had an oven-ready deal, and you chose to ditch that on February the 3rd, and you are now causing a right stink with the European Union and not behaving well in negotiations, and we're going to end up with no deal. Those are all good things for Labour to be saying. But of course, what that does mean is that, given that I don't think Keir has used one questioner PMQs to talk about Brexit, which again I understand, because that's exactly what Boris Johnson wants you to do. And when your enemy wants you to do something, it's very wise of you not to do it. But it does mean that we haven't had a proper debate we didn't have a proper debate about the potential extension in the summer. And in terms of the detail of Brexit and opposing the Tories on Brexit, that is largely falling to other political parties which don't get as much media attention as the Labour Party, and to parts of the media like yourself, Adam. And that means that we are therefore approaching the end of the transition period, and there'll be lots of things that the public just won't understand about the coming calamity. And it also it's going to make it harder for Labour in the future. I mean, the fact that just this past week, Keir has said, get Brexit done, and the Labour's put out memes on social media saying, get Brexit done. To be honest, if I was a Conservative strategist, I would have loved that, because I would have thought, well, whatever happens with Brexit now, when Keir Starmer next year comes and says, look, this is a disaster, Boris Johnson can just say, well, 6 months ago, you were saying get Brexit done. Why are you criticising me? And I do think it makes our job, Labour's job, harder in the future for us not to be saying as much as we could be saying now about the coming disaster.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? Or should we crack on? By the way, people who are watching, do continue sending questions in. I have noted them. I'm not ignoring them. I'm going to use the final 20 minutes, I hope. Theresa, I'm really keen while we've got you here, because you worked in the European Parliament for a number of years. You dealt with several policy areas. And I think when things like the Internal Market Bill and kind of the theatre of Parliament dominate the headlines, there are perhaps other issues of importance regarding the UK-EU relationship that perhaps don't get the attention they deserve. What for you, can you identify some areas which you think are important and just not getting any airtime at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole issue around standards and regulation. Workers' rights, you will have heard in the State of the Union address this week, which I never thought we'd actually hear from the Commission. They were actually talking about minimum wage and collective bargaining. So it's the whole fabric, the whole interrelationship. Just after the referendum, I walked into a meeting in the European Parliament and there was a Tory MEP and she said, and I quote, "The best thing about coming out of Europe is getting rid of all of this unnecessary health and safety legislation." You know, it's about the whole fabric of the way that we actually live our lives. And I think sometimes we talk about just the statistics and the amount of jobs, and we actually don't talk about the supply chain, we don't talk about the distribution chain, we don't talk about medicines, we don't talk about the EMA coming out of the UK. To strike a slightly more optimistic note, if I may, other groups in the Parliament still want to maintain relationships with us. And they're very clear. So I did a Zoom with the SPD in Germany a few weeks ago, and they really want to find out how we maintain relationships via the council, via the Committee of the Regions. I know the SDLP and Seamus was very involved in the Committee of the Regions. So how do we keep those relationships intact? And I have to say that there is still an extraordinary willingness to actually have strong links with the UK. So as Catherine was saying earlier, it's about how we maintain those links to optimise those benefits, so that, as Alison said, you know, there is some sort of way of making sure that those standards and regulations don't crash down. If we think about, you know, equal pay for work of equal value, if we think about gender equality, if we think about that in terms of artificial intelligence at the minute, Adam, in terms of our colleagues in the European Parliament, and because it's a consensual parliament, it's not just the Socialists and Democrats, it's the Greens, it's some of the EPP, it's Renew. My colleagues, I keep saying we, are actually working on an ethical framework for artificial intelligence. I mean, that's crucial for the future. You know, and what is the UK's relationship going to be and influence of that ethical framework? You know, I think it's something that Johnson, Cummings and co don't actually care about.
Thanks, Theresa. In your answer then, you mentioned relationships, which is what I wanted to touch upon before we go to audience questions. And I want to come to Matthew and Catherine. Catherine, in your role as a shadow foreign minister, and Matthew, obviously you both will have conversations with politicians, from figures from abroad, across Europe in the work you do. What do you think, how do you think the government's handling of Brexit at the moment, particularly on the IMB, is affecting the United Kingdom's international reputation?
I think it's terrible for our reputation. And I mentioned Amal Clooney before, but, you know, she's really just a symbol. People are very, very fed up with the UK, sort of in the, you know, the circuit of ambassadors. Lisa, Nandy and I have met with as many of the ambassadors as we possibly can since the beginning of the year. And they realise, you know, most of them obviously agree with the Labour position of a very close relationship with Europe. But it was really when Belarus started to fall apart and when we had the Navalny poisoning that I think it was really painful for Dominic Raab to have to turn around and say, well, can we work together on this at least? And of course, you know, we will work together with Angela Merkel and others on holding Putin to account. But you can just see how difficult it is with the Brexit elephant in the room there to do things together on the international stage. The other really big one is China, because obviously for Germany, which has long had a very strong relationship with China in trade terms, and Theresa will know this because your average MEP has a really good knowledge about trade negotiations and the way that you weave in debates about human rights into the trade dialogue, which I think we haven't even started to think about how we do that in the UK, and yet we're meant to be doing it in 3 months' time ourselves. You know, getting the 3 pillars of foreign policy right: trade, human rights and national security, and how you manage to get that kind of concept as a balancing act through all of the different relationships. And I feel that when we've had our crises like the Navalny poisoning and so on, you know, European partners have been, you know, very friendly really, but the Brexit negotiations are really getting in the way of us presenting a really, you know, really solid front. And, you know, from a Russian point of view, it's just great for Russia because it can see the fragmentation and the way that we're being dragged away from Europe. And that's just good for Russia and, you know, and especially for China as well, which obviously will do much better trade deals from their point of view if we're all fragmented and arguing and we're weakened. And of course, our economy is going to be weaker. So we're going to be literally cap in hand to some of these bigger powers. And then we're going to have a real conundrum about how we deal with Xinjiang, how we deal with Tibet, how we deal with the Hong Kong side of things. So, you know, we have a really complex situation ahead of us, and it's only being made worse by the likes of Mr. Gove and Cummings, who are insisting on this ridiculous international markets bill.
Thank you, Catherine. Matthew?
I'd echo a lot of what Catherine said. I think one point I would make is that, well, first of all, clearly Brexit has, the fact that Brexit was a shock to in terms of the UK's reputation internationally. It has become part of the narrative about populism in this decade, and has become one of the keystones of a narrative around rising populism. That means that, you know, traditional partners, diplomats, politicians, campaigners in other countries have seen the UK to be moving in a particular direction towards populism and, frankly, authoritarianism at times. And let's call it, be honest, and call it what it is and how it appears. That is shocking. As someone who's moved away from the kind of Westminster bubble to Belfast in the last 6 months to do the role I'm doing now, I think one of the things that strikes me is how I think there's a degree sometimes of denial within elements of the Westminster village about quite how much Britain's reputation has deteriorated. And a specific point I would make actually is in relation to part of what has made this a challenge for the UK's reputation internationally has been the appearance that it has at times almost sought to ally itself with Trump's America. Whenever all this comes to be written about in the years to come, I think one of the things people will think about is how the dynamic around Brexit and the creeping kind of right-wing populism and authoritarianism on the Brexit right was informed by and interacted with Trumpism in the United States. In many ways, part of the concern on the European side and on this island for the potential for a hard border has been connected to the enthusiasm among right-wingers in the Tory party for a trade deal with Trump's America. Part of the reason why the EU single market wants to know where the checks are going to happen is because the UK is saying, well, we're going to go off and diverge massively from your standards in order to have a trade deal with Trump's America. And it's not just the potential of a Trump trade deal, it's what that signifies, I think, to people like, frankly, Merkel or Macron or people across the continent of Europe in terms of where the UK stands on key fundamental values questions about liberal democracy and even at times the rule of law. The UK has, or when I say the UK, Johnson's UK, and to an extent before May's UK, although I think she ultimately thought better of it, have seemed to be drifting in a direction towards Trump. And if you're in the Elysee or you're in the German Chancellery, or frankly you're an activist in Eastern Europe who feels the threat of Putinism on your doorstep, you're looking at the UK and you're seeing a country which seems to be, parts of it anyway, seem to be content to ally itself with Trump's America. I think that's been deeply, deeply damaging to the UK's reputation. And in a very practical way, it's made the whole Brexit process more difficult, because part of what the EU and the Commission have been struggling with is the fact that you've got this potential, theoretical US trade deal facilitated by Trump and a God knows what kind of standards governing it. So that, in a sense, has made the whole process much more difficult.
Thanks, Matthew. We're gonna, for the final 20 minutes, go to questions from the audience. And we've had a few questions which relate to a trade deal between the UK and the EU. Someone has asked, David Taylor Gooby has asked, is our policy simply to get a better deal? An anonymous attendee asks, should we accept the EU's demands on state aid? So I think what it all comes down to, and someone else asks, another anonymous person asks, are there circumstances in which Labour might not support the deal? So I guess what it all boils down to is we know that Labour really wants a deal with the EU, but can we perhaps put a bit more flesh on the bone? Are there specific things Labour wants in that deal? For example, would Labour, as the question asks, would Labour accept EU demands on state aid, on fishing, etc.? And I guess the natural person to come to first would be Catherine, but I'm keen to hear the thoughts of other panellists too.
Thanks, Adam. I'll be quick because I know others will want this to use this opportunity to influence our approach. But my view is that, yes, we do want to hold the Tories to their promise to get Brexit done, which means a deal. And don't forget, most people, even those who voted Brexit were enthusiastic about it, believed it was about a high quality trade deal with the EU. And we know that certainly up until last summer when Mrs May was PM, she constantly stood up in the chamber and said, we want to have a close relationship with Europe. It was Mr Johnson who changed all that around. And obviously, we want to hold them to their promise. Now, there was a question that you asked in there that I had a specific answer to. What was the second part of the question, Adam? Sorry.
It was quite a convoluted question. I apologise. Didn't really go anywhere. Was it about state aid?
Yes, just to say on state aid, I mean, let's be realistic. Mr Sunak has just been a complete Marxist. He's just basically done exactly what John McDonnell would have done in the last few months in terms of the job retention scheme, government-backed loans for businesses, looking again at levels of universal credit. I mean, obviously, we would have taken out the 5-week wait for universal credit, and we would have put in better sick pay. And we would have been much more forensic about which sector needs which deal for longer, whereas this one size fits all we've complained a lot about. But that is state aid on steroids. I think the state aid thing is actually a bit of a red herring. I also think with fishing, there's definitely a deal to be done. Look, we have a fishing industry that's worth £1 billion. How much is fashion worth? 35 billion. Let's get serious that it's not really about these two issues, even though the negotiators are sort of saying, these are the two key issues. I don't believe it's about that. I think there's sort of high politics in this about how do we, be the most sort of reactionary right-wing Brexiteers that we can, and how do we completely break free so that we don't have to pay any attention to EU law on the environment, on, workers' rights, the thing that Allison was talking about TUPE rights. How do we get that complete freedom to do exactly what we want without complying with international standards and aligning ourselves with the EU? Even though if you actually ask them, they'll say, oh no, of course we want to keep with the EU gold standard. We'll just read the Internal Market Bill. So I think we're dealing with a very, very reactionary right-wing party, and we don't have the good people who used to be in the Tory party. And what I can take away from today's panel is that we need to redouble our efforts to be a bit more like Ed Miliband in the chamber the other day and say, when is this government going to take responsibility for the direction it's taking the country, which is basically very downhill, very fast.
Thanks, Catherine. I'd like to offer the other participants the chance to accept Catherine's invitation to influence Labour policy. So Alison and Theresa, if you can, as pithy as possible, what would you like to see in a trade deal? What are the things Labour shouldn't accept or should be really pushing for?
I'll just be very quick. I think it's a bit more global. I follow WTO talks, And if you look at what's happening in the WTO itself, there's a massive schism between those who want multilateral agreements. So there are universal rights, if you like, set out in all trade agreements, and those who want plurilateral agreements, where some countries will say, actually, we can lower rights, you know, but we'll just do it together. We don't have to all do it. So what the government is actually ending up drifting towards is like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where they literally are quite happy to remove rights completely in trade deals. And I think Catherine is right. That is the direction of where the government is going. It's going beyond Brexit, going even beyond the United States. It will be joining forces with countries who literally will be prepared to move workers around the world with no rights. Indentured labour almost, because that is actually what is happening in some of the discussions that fall out of the WTO. So we do still have to have an international outlook, as Catherine is saying, around also what Labour is going, how Labour is responding to these bigger issues going on in the WTO. The second thing is that state aid is seen as a level playing field, but I agree, like Catherine, it's just a smokescreen, because even the EU, you could say, you could sort of, can we write a case to why we might want to do this? There are exemptions. People use exemptions and state aid all the time for various reasons. So I really just don't believe, it's a red herring, I'm afraid. So I'll leave my bit there. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. And Theresa, what would you like, what should Labour be calling for? What should it refuse to accept when it comes to a trade deal with the EU?
Thank you, Adam. Just to completely agree with Catherine and Allison that state aid is a complete red herring. If we look at actually how other member states interpreted state aid, you know, it is absolute complete nonsense. Environmental standards are absolutely critical. Workers' rights. What's scary, Adam, is that what the Tory party did was not only did they not send ministers to council meetings when they could have done till the end of January, they actually withdrew their civil servants from the technical meetings when they could have been there to the end of January. And as Catherine says, it takes up to 7 years to negotiate a trade deal. And we had got to the point where we were including climate proofing, gender proofing, as well critically as human rights. And it's got to be the closest alignment that we can achieve, because if we're going to get out of this dreadful pandemic and climate crisis, the way to do that is via the closest cooperation possible. And that has got to be about a green recovery and not diminishing our climate standards in the UK.
Thanks, Theresa. Mike, as someone who spent a number of years trying to persuade the Labour leadership to do X, Y, and Z, what would you like to see?
I think that Labour could do a couple of things, really. I think one thing that Labour should do or could do would be to just articulate to the public how far things have shifted from 2016 and the Brexit that was put before people in 2016 and the Brexit we're going to get, and the chasm between the two. And not just in terms of saying, oh, it's become more right-wing or it's become harder, because people don't know what that means. But in terms of talking about workers' rights, talking about environmental regulations, talking about food prices, talking about access to medicines, and real-world things that will change next year and that people did not vote for and weren't told about. So I think that's one thing. And then I think the other thing, and along the same lines really, is to go back to the deal that Johnson negotiated last year and that was put before the electorate as a, amazing, stupendous, world-beating deal, whatever it is, that as soon as we got past January the 31st, Johnson dropped like a stone. I mean, the political declaration, which included commitments on state aid and fishing and workers' rights and, all these things that we're now talking about. Even that was a pretty hard Brexit as compared to Theresa May's Brexit or single market, customs union, etc. But it was obviously far, far better than we're going to end up with, because if Johnson gets the deal that he wants, it's going to be even worse than that. And we're likely heading for no deal, because I struggle to see how we come to, the UK and the EU come to an agreement on the things that they're stuck over. But I think for Labour, it's about saying to the public, this is what's different. This is what you're going to get. Is this what you wanted? And to talk about it through the prism of people's real lives, rather than through the prism of Brexit, Remain, Leave, this is what the EU wants, this is what's happening in the negotiations. I kind of feel like the government are getting away with so much, just partly because of how we framed this conversation.
Thanks, Mike. I have two very specific questions which I'm keen to ask. The first, and I think this is definitely one for Catherine and one you'd like to answer, Catherine, is when will Labour start talking about voting rights of UK citizens in the EU and abroad? And the second question, very specific one, is from Fiona O'Farrell, and she asks, do Irish citizens in the UK need to worry about their rights after Brexit? The common travel policy, I should say, doesn't have any rights attached to it. Should we consider applying for settled status? So Catherine, would you like to handle the first question on the rights of UK people abroad?
So I think this was about UK citizens, so not the 3 million who are here, the 3.8 million who have applied for settled status, but those UK citizens living abroad who want to exercise their right to vote. And certainly the current position is, as people know, because they will have been volunteering in elections, if you are living abroad, say because you're you're doing a short stay somewhere, you can vote by post. Now, whether your postal ballot gets back in time to be counted is always a bit of a trick. But until we really have e-voting, understanding how it would work is tricky, because obviously returning a postal ballot quickly enough is difficult, because your registration to vote is based on your address. So I think we'd have to really debate that and look at the pros and cons of that. But obviously we haven't got a policy yet, because our National Policy Forum is really only just now positioning itself to start taking points into consideration. But I'm certainly happy to feed that back into our National Policy Forum. Just very briefly on the EU voting rights, obviously Labour's manifesto in 2019 promised to give EU nationals the right to vote in local elections and general elections, because at the moment it's only local and regional elections. And we felt that was so important, because if they'd been able to vote in 2016, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. So I think it's really important, and I took the urgent question just in advance of the 2019 European election, where it was made very, very difficult for European nationals to vote. You'd all remember that they pretended that you had to go back through your original ambassador in order to get the right to vote, and all this sort of nonsense. And I brought an urgent question to the Commons based on that. And they were still saying, well, there's not going to be an election because we're getting a deal at the end of this month. So in May, there won't be an election. Of course there was an election. Of course, the European elections were a disaster for Labour. But I think all of the voting rights situation we will look again at in due course in advance of the next general election.
Thank you. And the second question, which was, do Irish citizens in the UK need to worry about their rights after Brexit? I thought maybe Matthew and Theresa can perhaps handle that question if you'd like.
I think the short answer is yes. There aren't enough details yet on how the common travel area was used by Brexiteers as an alibi for not talking about the threat to the border of Brexit, but also the threat to bilateral British-Irish relations, to the extent that they ever bothered talking about it. And as people know, the common travel area is not. Sometimes it's described as if it's a single document or a charter enshrined in law. It isn't. It is a set of. It's a range of things, ranging from administrative agreements between the UK and Ireland to the bureaucratic practice that has built up over the years. Some of which is underpinned in legislation, some of which isn't. There have been progress in specific areas in terms of and clearly the bits are enshrined in the withdrawal agreement, but there's lots of unanswered questions, to go back to the theme of our discussion. In terms of whether to apply for EU settled status or not, I don't think it's, not to be flippant, I'm not sure applying for EU settled status is necessarily required for individuals. Obviously, individuals will make that decision for themselves in terms of how they want, in terms of the certainty they want for their rights. But there still are a huge number of unanswered questions around the rights of Irish citizens.
Theresa?
Yes, there are still some unanswered questions, and I think, Catherine, that's something that we should be campaigning on very vociferously. I think that's something that could give people a lot of comfort quickly. It affects part of my family. I would hesitate to say that I wouldn't fear the worst. So I think we just need to make absolutely certain it can't happen.
Thanks, Theresa. And I think we probably have time for one last question. And it's from John Gaskell. And he asks, what can we do locally and in CLPs to show our pro-EU beliefs while respecting Keir Starmer's position on Brexit, open brackets, or at least not disrespecting it, close brackets? So, Mike?
Sorry, I missed the question.
That's all right. The question was, what can campaigners in the Labour Party do locally and in their CLPs to show their pro-EU beliefs while respecting Keir Starmer and Labour's position on Brexit?
Well, I mean, just to say, I mean, one part of that briefly, I mean, we all respect Keir Starmer, and certainly I do, and I voted for Keir, and I'm delighted that I did, and I'm delighted that he's leader of the Labour Party, and I trust that he's going to take us into power. But I think there are ways to have this conversation. There are ways to talk about Brexit and any other policy issue in ways that are supportive of the leadership and that are constructive, you know, and engaging in constructive debate. So I think for people in their CLPs, I mean, if you've got a Labour MP, talk to your MP. Your MP does not know everything. Your MP is a very well-intentioned human being who works really hard and deals with 1,000 different issues on a daily basis and has people saying stuff to them, you know, left, right and centre. And hears and sees the same media that you do. But they don't know everything that you know, and they don't know what your opinion is. So please talk to your MP, do so in a respectful manner, but recognising that they want the same future that you want. Almost certainly. So please do that and be kind to them and say thank you for all their hard work when you do that. If you don't have a Labour MP, then of course you can contact the policy team in HQ. It amazes me how many Labour members I find get really angry about what the party's doing. And when I say, well, have you contacted the policy team, or have you written to the leader's office, or have you spoken to your MP, or have you spoken to your council leader, or whatever, they'll look at me blankly and say, well, no, I've just tweeted about it or ranted at my friends. You know, we all, as members, we all have many, many opportunities to speak into the Labour Party, you know, through our trade unions or through contact to the policy team or our MP or our former MP. So take those opportunities, and we're all on the same team. Let's do it kindly and understand that people have different opinions and they may make a different choice, but we want to go on and have this conversation and do so constructively.
Thanks, Mike. Catherine, as an MP, how should people in your CLP who perhaps still want to remain, perhaps don't agree with Labour's current position on Brexit, want it to be something different, how should they, what's the best way for them to go about?
I think what might be a useful exercise is to ask, you know, people in CLPs, what are the top 3 things that you'd like to see Labour focus on in the run-up to, you know, the 1st of January 2021. Now, obviously, some of that's going to be COVID related, but specifically around Brexit, because I think Theresa emphasised environment. For people who really care in the Labour movement about human rights, it's going to be about how the government in future will weave human rights into trade deals. If you're coming from a trade union point of view, how will we protect workers in a post-Brexit environment? Or if you run a small business, you know, what will be the added burden to your organisation through a Brexit, particularly if you're in food, because I think food and our agriculture sector is going to be hammered, whether it's through the obvious one, which is the US, or whether it's through other countries, because lots of countries just mainly export food, and because we're all going to be so much poorer, cheap food is going to be really important. So I think a survey would be really good. Maybe Mike and I could work something up that we could put out to CLPs, which could say, what are your top 3 priorities for a post-Brexit UK?
Thanks, Catherine. I'm very sadly, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. There is so much we could discuss but haven't discussed. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to everyone who tuned in on a weirdly hot late summer's day. Of course, it's a shame we couldn't do this in person in Liverpool, but hopefully this time next year we'll be all in a room together. So yeah, thank you so much for coming along, and keep following Brexit.
Great to see you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Everybody.
Well done, Adam.
Thank you very much, everyone.
See you all soon.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
See you, Mike. Take care.